What if I told you that the year 1700 wasn't just another date on the calendar, but the moment when humanity's true history was deliberately erased and replaced with a carefully constructed lie? What if everything you learned about the past in school, every museum exhibit you've ever seen, every historical documentary you've ever watched was part of an elaborate cover-up designed to hide the most catastrophic event in human history? The evidence has been staring us in the face for centuries. It's written in stone, preserved in paintings, captured in the earliest photographs, and buried beneath every major city on Earth. But we've been trained not to see it. We've been conditioned to accept comfortable explanations that don't actually explain anything at all. Today, we're going to uncover the truth they tried to bury forever. My name is Alex, and I've spent the last 5 years investigating what might be the greatest deception ever perpetrated against humanity. What started as casual curiosity about some odd historical details has become an obsession that has fundamentally changed how I see the world around me. And by the end of this video, it will change how you see it too. But before we dive into the evidence, I need to warn you about something. Once you see what I'm about to show you, you can never unsee it. You'll start noticing things everywhere. Buildings that don't make sense. Photographs that tell a different story than their captions. Historical timelines that contradict physical evidence. You'll realize that the comfortable version of history we've all accepted is built on sand, and that sand is shifting beneath our feet. Now, let me start with something simple. Something you can verify yourself right now if you live in any major city. Go outside and look at the oldest buildings in your area. Really look at them. Notice how many have what appear to be basement windows at street level. Notice how many have doors that seem to lead directly into the ground. Notice how the first floors of these buildings sit strangely low, almost as if they're partially buried. The standard explanation for this phenomenon is something called the cultural layer. We're told that over hundreds of years, dust, debris, and human activity gradually raised the street level, burying the lower portions of older buildings. This explanation is repeated so often, in so many places, that most people never think to question it. But there's a fundamental problem with this comfortable theory. The mathematics don't work. Cultural layers, when they actually occur through natural processes, accumulate at a rate of perhaps a few inches per century. Maybe a foot or two over several hundred years, in the most extreme cases. But what we see in cities across Europe, America, and Russia isn't a few inches or even a few feet. We're looking at entire floors buried under 10, 15, sometimes 20 feet of earth. That's not gradual accumulation. That's something else entirely. I first became aware of this discrepancy 3 years ago while visiting Prague. I was admiring the medieval architecture when I noticed something odd about one of the churches. The ornate entrance, clearly designed to be grand and imposing, was accessed by walking down a set of stairs that descended below street level. This wasn't a basement entrance. The architectural details, the quality of stonework, the proportions, all indicated this was meant to be the main entrance to the building. But it was underground. My tour guide gave me the standard explanation about cultural layers and urban development. It sounded reasonable enough. But then I started noticing the same thing in other cities. Vienna, Budapest, Moscow, London, Paris. Everywhere I went, I found buildings that seemed to be sinking into the earth. Buildings with basement windows that clearly weren't designed to be basement windows. Structures that made perfect architectural sense, except for the fact that half of them were buried. The turning point came when I discovered the work of a researcher who had spent decades documenting this phenomenon. He had collected thousands of photographs from the 19th and early 20th centuries showing cities in the process of being excavated, not built, excavated. Massive construction projects involving steam shovels, railway systems, and armies of workers digging entire city blocks out from under tons of earth. These weren't minor street improvements or utility installations. These were colossal earthworks that moved millions of cubic yards of soil. The scale was comparable to building the cities themselves. Yet this monumental effort, this incredible feat of engineering that reshaped urban landscapes across the globe, is treated in history books as routine maintenance, street regrading projects, infrastructure improvements. Nothing to see here. But where did all that earth come from? And more importantly, where did it go? You can't move mountains of soil without leaving a trace. If millions of tons of earth were removed from city centres, they had to be deposited somewhere. The logistics alone would have been staggering, yet there's virtually no documentation of disposal sites, no evidence of the massive earthworks that should have resulted from such operations. The more I researched this topic, the more disturbing the picture became. The buried buildings weren't isolated anomalies. They were part of a global pattern. From St. Petersburg to San Francisco, from Istanbul to Chicago, the same phenomenon appeared everywhere. Entire urban areas had been buried under layers of earth and then systematically excavated in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And then I found the photographs. Thousands of them. Preserved in archives and private collections around the world. Images that show cities in states that defy everything we think we know about urban development. Pictures of buildings emerging from the earth like archaeological discoveries. Structures standing at impossible angles, tilted and partially collapsed, as if they had been subjected to enormous forces. Streets that descended into the ground and disappeared into darkness. One photograph in particular stopped me cold. It showed a massive stone building in Kansas City, dated 1867, buried up to its second floor in earth. Not damaged, not ruined, simply buried, as if the ground had risen up around it like a slow flood. The building was clearly intact beneath the soil, its windows and doorways preserved but hidden, waiting to be excavated. This wasn't the work of time and gradual accumulation. This was the aftermath of something sudden and catastrophic. Something that had deposited enormous quantities of earth across vast areas in a relatively short period. But what could cause such a thing? What force could bury entire cities under tons of soil without completely destroying them? The official explanations began to seem increasingly inadequate. Street improvements don't require excavating buildings from their foundations. Urban development doesn't typically involve digging entire neighborhoods out of the ground. And cultural layers don't accumulate in neat, uniform depths across thousands of square miles. As I delved deeper into this mystery, I began to encounter other anomalies in the historical record, gaps in documentation from certain periods, inconsistencies in architectural dating, technologies that appeared suddenly in the historical record without clear developmental pathways, art and literature that seemed to describe events and capabilities that didn't fit the accepted timeline. The more evidence I accumulated, the more convinced I became that we're not looking at isolated mysteries or coincidental anomalies. We're looking at the traces of something much larger, something that has been systematically obscured or explained away, something that challenges our fundamental assumptions about human history and the development of civilization. The year 1700 keeps appearing in this investigation, not as a hard boundary, but as a pivot point, a moment when something changed, when old records stop and new ones begin, when architectural styles shift abruptly, when technologies that should have taken centuries to develop appear almost overnight, when entire categories of historical documentation simply vanish from the record. What happened around 1700? What event could have been so significant, so devastating, that it required the complete reconstruction of human history? And why has this event been erased from our collective memory? The answer lies not in secret archives or hidden documents, but in plain sight, in the buildings we walk past every day, in the photographs hanging in museums and stored in libraries, in the very ground beneath our feet. The evidence has been preserved, but its meaning has been deliberately obscured. We've been taught to see these anomalies as normal, to accept explanations that don't actually explain anything, to believe that the impossible is routine and that the extraordinary is mundane. But once you start asking the right questions, once you begin to see the patterns that connect these seemingly isolated mysteries, a very different picture emerges. This isn't just about buried buildings or mysterious photographs. This is about the nature of human civilization itself, about who we really are, where we really came from, and what we've forgotten about our own past. The implications of this investigation extend far beyond historical curiosity. They touch on fundamental questions about human capability, about the stability of our current civilization, and about the forces that shape human development over time. In the next part of this investigation, we'll examine the evidence that points to a specific catastrophic event around 1700. We'll look at the eyewitness accounts that were dismissed as fantasy. We'll explore the technologies that shouldn't have existed, and we'll uncover the deliberate efforts to erase this event from human memory. But for now, I want you to go outside and look at your city with fresh eyes. Notice the buildings that seem to sink into the ground. Pay attention to the basement windows that look like they were once ground level. Ask yourself why so many structures seem to be partially buried. And remember that sometimes the most important truths are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to ask the questions that everyone else has forgotten how to ask. The evidence is everywhere. We just need to learn how to see it, how to see. The deeper you dig into this mystery, the more you realize that what we're dealing with isn't just missing information, it's active suppression. Someone, at some point in history, made a deliberate decision to bury the truth about 1700 and everything that came before it. The question is who, and more importantly, why? Let me show you something that will make your skin crawl. I want you to imagine you're a historian in the year 1850. You're tasked with writing the definitive account of European history for the past 500 years. You have access to libraries, archives, official records, and eyewitness accounts. This should be straightforward work. After all, we're talking about relatively recent history, well within the span of written records and institutional memory. But as you begin your research, you discover something deeply unsettling. The further back you go towards 1700, the more the records begin to thin out. Not gradually, as you might expect from natural decay or loss over time, but abruptly, dramatically. As if someone had systematically removed entire categories of documentation from the historical record. Church records that should span centuries mysteriously begin around 1720. Municipal archives that should contain unbroken chains of civic documentation show gaps of decades. Personal diaries and correspondence from noble families, the kind of material that aristocrats obsessively preserved for posterity, simply vanish for the period between 1680 and 1720. This pattern appears across Europe with suspicious consistency. It's not random loss due to war or fire or natural disaster. It's systematic, it's coordinated, and it all centers around those crucial decades at the turn of the 18th century. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. The records that do exist from this period often contradict each other in fundamental ways. Population figures that don't match between different sources. Architectural projects attributed to different time periods by different authorities. Trade records that show economic activity that shouldn't have been possible given the supposed population and infrastructure of the time. It's as if multiple competing versions of history were being written simultaneously, and someone later had to choose which version would become official. The inconsistencies we see today are the remnants of that process, the loose ends that couldn't be completely cleaned up. Now you might be thinking that this is just the normal messiness of historical records. Medieval and early modern record keeping was notoriously unreliable, after all. But that's exactly the problem. The inconsistencies aren't random or chaotic in the way you'd expect from poor record keeping. They're systematic, they follow patterns, and those patterns all point to the same conclusion. Someone rewrote history around 1700. The most obvious evidence for this rewriting, appears in something called the New Style Calendar Reform. In 1700, most European countries abruptly abandoned the calendar system they had been using for over 1,000 years and adopted the Gregorian calendar we use today. The official explanation is that this was a rational modernization, bringing different nations into alignment with each other and correcting accumulated errors in the old system. But look at what this calendar change actually accomplished. It didn't just alter how years were numbered, it fundamentally restructured how time itself was conceived. The old calendar system counted years from the supposed creation of the world. Under that system, the year 1700 would have been approximately 7,208 years since creation. The new system counted years from the birth of Christ, making 1700 simply 1700 AD. This wasn't just a technical adjustment. It was a complete reconceptualization of human history. The old system implied a world that was thousands of years older, with a much deeper and more complex past. The new system compressed that past into a neat, manageable timeline that fit perfectly with emerging theories about human development and progress. Think about what this means. A calendar isn't just a way of tracking days and months. It's the framework upon which all historical understanding hangs. Every event, every reign, every war, every achievement is placed in time according to the calendar. Change the calendar, and you can rearrange history itself. The Gregorian reform allowed for the insertion of entirely new historical periods. The so-called Dark Ages, conveniently placed between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, provided a 1,000-year gap where any inconsistency could be hidden, where any artifact that didn't fit the new timeline could be safely attributed to mysterious medieval craftsmen working by candlelight. But the calendar change was just the beginning. Around the same time, we see the emergence of what historians call the Age of Enlightenment. Suddenly, across Europe, there was an explosion of scientific advancement, architectural achievement, and cultural sophistication that seemed to come from nowhere. Isaac Newton published his Principia in 1687, revolutionizing physics and mathematics. Christopher Wren redesigned London with architectural principles that seemed decades ahead of their time. Bach composed music of such mathematical complexity that it still challenges modern musicians. Handel created operas that defined musical drama for centuries. We're told this was the natural flowering of human genius, the inevitable result of throwing off medieval superstition and embracing rational thought. But the timeline doesn't make sense. You don't go from feudalism to advanced mathematics overnight. You don't leap from Gothic architecture to Baroque masterpieces without centuries of gradual development. Unless, of course, this wasn't development at all. What if the Enlightenment wasn't about discovering new knowledge, but about rediscovering old knowledge? What if these supposed geniuses weren't inventing revolutionary concepts, but simply revealing technologies and techniques that had been hidden or forgotten? This interpretation explains something that mainstream historians struggle with. Why did the Enlightenment happen when it did? Why did it happen where it did? And why did it spread so quickly across such vast distances at a time when communication and travel were supposedly primitive? The answer becomes clear when you realize that the Enlightenment wasn't a spontaneous cultural movement. It was a coordinated effort to introduce pre-existing knowledge into a world that had been deliberately kept ignorant of its own past. Consider the case of Johann Sebastian Bach. We're told he was a provincial church musician who somehow created the most mathematically sophisticated music in human history. His compositions demonstrate an understanding of harmonic relationships, mathematical ratios, and acoustic principles that wouldn't be formally codified by music theorists for another century. But Bach left behind almost no writings about his methods, no treatises explaining his techniques, no correspondence discussing his revolutionary approaches to composition. For someone supposedly inventing entirely new forms of musical expression, he was remarkably silent about how he did it. The same pattern appears with other Enlightenment figures. They achieved the impossible, but they couldn't explain how. They revolutionized their fields, but they left no clear trail of development. It's as if they had access to information that they couldn't or wouldn't discuss publicly. What if Bach wasn't composing from scratch, but rather transcribing and adapting musical systems that already existed? What if Newton wasn't discovering the laws of physics, but rediscovering principles that had been known and then forgotten? What if the entire Enlightenment was essentially a massive archaeological project, digging up intellectual treasures from a buried past? This theory explains why Enlightenment achievements often seem to appear fully formed, without the expected centuries of gradual development. It explains why these supposed innovations spread so quickly across Europe. And it explains why so many Enlightenment figures were connected to institutions like the Royal Society, the Freemasons, and various secret societies that claimed to preserve ancient wisdom. These organizations weren't just social clubs for educated gentlemen. They were repositories of knowledge that had been preserved through the dark period following whatever catastrophe occurred around 1700. When conditions became stable enough, this knowledge was gradually reintroduced to the world, carefully packaged as new discoveries to avoid awkward questions about where it really came from. The evidence for this hidden knowledge appears everywhere once you know how to look for it. The architectural plans for St. Paul's Cathedral in London, supposedly designed by Christopher Wren, show engineering principles that shouldn't have been understood for another 2 centuries. The mathematical concepts in Newton's Principia reference ideas that weren't supposed to exist until the 20th century. The harmonic structures in Bach's music incorporate acoustic principles that weren't formally discovered until the invention of electronic sound analysis. We're looking at a civilization that possessed advanced knowledge, lost it catastrophically around 1700, and then spent the next century carefully reconstructing it while pretending it was all new. The Enlightenment wasn't the birth of modern science. It was the resurrection of ancient science. But who was behind this resurrection? Who had the authority and resources to coordinate such a massive deception across multiple countries and institutions? Who decided what knowledge would be revealed and when? And most importantly, who decided that the truth about the catastrophe itself would be buried forever? The answer lies in examining the institutions that emerged during this period. The same organizations that supposedly fostered Enlightenment thinking also controlled the narrative about the past. They wrote the history books. They established the universities. They determined what would be taught and what would be forgotten. These weren't just academic institutions. They were instruments of control, designed to manage human knowledge and keep dangerous truths safely buried. And they're still operating today, still protecting the secret of 1700, still ensuring that we never learn the truth about our own past. The conspiracy isn't hidden in shadowy backrooms or secret meetings. It's operating in plain sight. In every university, every museum, every history book that perpetuates the lie that human civilization developed gradually and naturally over thousands of years. The truth is that we're recovering from a fall, not progressing toward a peak. And everything we think we know about our own history has been carefully constructed to hide that fact. The most damning evidence for this systematic deception comes from an unexpected source: the art world. Specifically, a collection of paintings and engravings that have been staring us in the face for centuries, dismissed by art historians as romantic fantasies when they're actually forensic documentation of the greatest cover-up in human history. I'm talking about the works of artists like Giovanni Battista Piranesi, Hubert Robert, and dozens of others who worked in the 18th and early 19th centuries. These men created thousands of detailed images showing ancient Roman structures, but there's something profoundly wrong with what they depicted. Something that should make every art historian deeply uncomfortable. These aren't paintings of ruins weathered by centuries of gradual decay. These are crime scene photographs captured in oils and copper etchings. Every single image shows the same thing: massive stone structures that have been violently destroyed and then buried under enormous quantities of earth and debris. Look at Piranesi's famous etchings of Rome. In image after image, you see colossal buildings snapped in half as if struck by tremendous force. Columns that aren't gradually crumbling from age but shattered, their broken ends jutting into the sky at impossible angles. Walls that haven't slowly weathered away, but have been torn apart as if by the hands of giants. And everywhere, the earth itself has risen up to swallow these structures. In Piranesi's work, you can see people walking on what was clearly once the second or third story of buildings. The original street level is gone, buried under meters of soil that arrived suddenly and catastrophically. The art establishment wants you to believe these are imaginative reconstructions of how Rome might have looked in ancient times. But Piranesi wasn't working from imagination. He was trained as an architect and engineer. His work demonstrates an obsessive attention to structural detail, to the physics of weight and stress, to precise measurements and proportions. These aren't fantasies. They're technical documents. And here's what makes it even more unsettling. Modern analysis of Piranesi's original copper plates reveals something that shouldn't be possible. Under high magnification, the images don't show the characteristic marks of hand engraving. Instead, they show patterns of tiny, perfectly uniform dots. This is the signature of a photochemical process. In other words, Piranesi was using a form of photography in the 18th century, decades before its supposed invention. The technology was called camera obscura, and officially, we're told it was only used as an aid for drawing. But what if some artist had access to chemical compounds that could fix the projected image directly onto metal plates? This would explain Piranesi's impossible productivity, his photographic precision, his ability to capture details that would be impossible to achieve through manual engraving alone. But it would also mean that advanced technology survived whatever catastrophe occurred around 1700. It means that knowledge hadn't been completely lost, that some survivors still understood optics, chemistry, and photosensitive compounds. They possessed capabilities that official history claims wouldn't be rediscovered for another century. The same pattern appears across Europe. In Russia, artists like Fyodor Alexeyev painted cityscapes showing buildings half drowned in flowing mud, as if waves of earth had washed over them from above. In France, Hubert Robert created canvases showing magnificent structures in states of fresh collapse, with crude, temporary shelters huddled at their base like refugee camps. These artists weren't romanticizing the past. They were documenting the present. They were showing the world as it existed in their time, a landscape of ruins being slowly excavated and reclaimed by survivors of an unimaginable catastrophe. But perhaps the most explicit evidence comes from an artist whose work has been almost entirely suppressed. Konstantin Bogaevsky created paintings with titles that leave no room for interpretation. The star Wormwood shows a city being simultaneously destroyed by flowing mud and illuminated by a brilliant flash in the sky, like an explosion or impact event. This isn't metaphorical art. This is eyewitness testimony. Bogaevsky was documenting what his generation remembered about the catastrophe, encoding the truth in images that survived even as written records were systematically destroyed. The suppression of this evidence required enormous coordination. After Piranesi's death, the Vatican moved quickly to secure complete control of his copper plates. Every single matrix was purchased and centralized under direct church supervision. A special institute was established, ostensibly to preserve these artistic treasures, but really to ensure they remained under control. Similar patterns appear across Europe. Art collections were reorganized. Certain works were moved to private collections or stored in basement archives where they couldn't be studied. The interpretation of these images was carefully managed, reframed as romantic fantasy rather than historical documentation. But they couldn't destroy everything. Too many copies had been made. Too many prints had been distributed. The evidence scattered across museums and private collections worldwide, waiting for someone to recognize what they were really looking at. When you understand this context, the true horror of what happened becomes clear. We're not just looking at the aftermath of a natural disaster. We're looking at evidence of something that nearly wiped human civilization from the face of the earth. Something so devastating that the survivors decided it was better to forget than to remember. The buried buildings, the mysterious photographs, the artistic documentation, they all point to the same conclusion. Around 1700, something struck this planet with such force that it buried entire cities under meters of debris. The impact was global, affecting every continent, every major population center. But here's what makes it even more terrifying. The evidence suggests this wasn't the first time. The geological record shows multiple layers of such catastrophic deposition. The mythologies of every ancient culture describe previous worlds that were destroyed in cycles. The Hindu concept of yugas, the Mayan long count calendar, the Hopi prophecies of previous worlds, they're all describing the same phenomenon. Human civilization doesn't progress in a straight line from primitive to advanced. It rises and falls in cycles, driven by cosmic catastrophes that occur with predictable regularity. We're not the first advanced civilization to inhabit this planet, and we won't be the last. The survivors of the 1700 event faced an impossible choice. They could tell their children the truth about what had happened, traumatizing them with knowledge of humanity's vulnerability and the temporary nature of all achievement. Or they could create a new narrative, a comforting lie that made the current world seem stable and permanent. They chose the lie. And every generation since has been raised in that lie, taught to believe in gradual progress and linear development, never told that we're actually recovering from a fall that nearly destroyed our species entirely. The institutions we trust to preserve and transmit knowledge are the same institutions that were created to maintain this deception. Universities, museums, historical societies, they all serve the same function, keeping us ignorant of our true past while making us feel educated and informed. But the evidence is breaking through. The internet has made it impossible to completely control information. Independent researchers are connecting dots that were never supposed to be connected. The truth about 1700 is emerging despite centuries of careful suppression. We're living in the ruins of a previous civilization, pretending we built everything ourselves. The magnificent architecture we attribute to our ancestors was inherited, not created. The technologies we think we invented were rediscovered, not developed. Even our languages, our cultures, our social structures are echoes of something far older and more sophisticated than we've been allowed to remember. The question now isn't whether this catastrophe happened. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is what we do with this knowledge. Do we continue living in the comfortable lie, or do we face the terrifying truth about our vulnerability and start preparing for what's coming next? Because if the cycles are real, if these catastrophes occur with predictable regularity, then we're overdue. The signs are already appearing in our climate, our magnetic field, our astronomical environment. The next reset may be closer than we think. And when it comes, will we be like the survivors of 1700, forced to rebuild from scratch while hiding the truth from our children? Or will we finally break the cycle of amnesia and preserve the knowledge that could help humanity survive and thrive through whatever cosmic challenges await us? The choice is ours. But first, we have to wake up from the dream they've been selling us for 3 centuries. We have to see the world as it really is: beautiful, ancient, fragile, and far stranger than we ever imagined. The evidence I'm about to show you will fundamentally challenge everything you believe about human capability and the stability of our world. We've established that something catastrophic happened around 1700, that entire cities were buried and then excavated, that advanced knowledge was preserved and carefully reintroduced as new discoveries. But there's another layer to this deception that's even more disturbing. I want you to consider the population records from the 18th and 19th centuries. Something extraordinary happened during this period that demographers struggle to explain. Between 1750 and 1850, the global population supposedly doubled. Not gradually, as you might expect from improved agriculture or medical advances, but in a sudden explosion of human beings that appears almost overnight in the historical record. Where did all these people come from? The standard explanation involves the agricultural revolution and early industrialization creating conditions for rapid population growth. But when you examine the actual data, the numbers don't add up. Agricultural improvements don't typically cause population to double in a single century. Medical advances of the era weren't sophisticated enough to dramatically reduce mortality rates. Yet somehow, vast numbers of people appeared in population centers across the globe. Here's what makes it even stranger. Many of these new population centers weren't expanding existing communities. They were entirely new settlements, appearing in locations that had previously been sparsely inhabited or completely empty. Mining towns, railroad cities, industrial centers, all springing up simultaneously across different continents with populations that seem to materialize from thin air. The documentation for where these people came from is remarkably sparse. Family genealogies that should trace back multiple generations often hit dead ends around 1720 or 1730. Birth records from this period are incomplete or missing entirely. Immigration records don't account for the scale of population movement we're seeing. It's as if a substantial portion of humanity simply appeared in the historical record around the mid-18th century without clear origins or ancestry. And when you combine this with the evidence of buried cities and catastrophic events around 1700, a disturbing picture begins to emerge. What if the population explosion wasn't natural growth at all? What if it was repopulation? What if the catastrophic event we've been discussing didn't just bury cities, but also decimated the human population on a global scale? The survivors would have faced an enormous challenge, rebuilding civilization with drastically reduced numbers. In such a scenario, normal reproduction would be far too slow to restore population levels within a reasonable time frame. It would take centuries for small groups of survivors to naturally multiply into the millions needed to operate complex societies. But there's another possibility, one that explains both the rapid population recovery and the strange gaps in genealogical records. The technology for artificial human cultivation may be far older than we've been told. The same advanced knowledge that was preserved and reintroduced during the Enlightenment might have included sophisticated understanding of human reproduction and development. What we think of as cutting-edge genetic science could actually be rediscovered techniques from a previous civilization. This sounds like science fiction until you examine certain historical anomalies from the period. The sudden appearance of massive institutional complexes designed specifically for housing and raising children. Foundling hospitals, orphanages, and charitable institutions that sprang up across Europe and America with suspicious coordination and funding. These weren't small local charities. They were enormous operations capable of housing thousands of children simultaneously. The Foundling Hospital in London, established in 1739, was designed to handle up to 15,000 children. Similar institutions appeared in Paris, Vienna, St. Petersburg, and dozens of other cities around the same time period. The official explanation is that these institutions responded to increased abandonment of children due to poverty and social upheaval. But the scale doesn't match the supposed need. We're talking about industrial-level child-rearing operations that required massive resources and sophisticated organizational systems. What's even more suspicious is how these children were distributed. The orphan trains that operated in America between 1854 and 1929 transported over 200,000 children from eastern cities to rural areas in the West and Midwest. This wasn't random charity. This was systematic population distribution, moving people to specific locations where labor and settlement were needed. The children themselves often had no clear memories of their origins. Many couldn't provide information about their parents or families. They seemed to have appeared in the institutional system without clear documentation of how they got there. And they were remarkably healthy and well-developed, despite supposedly coming from conditions of poverty and abandonment. Contemporary observers noted something strange about these institutional children. They often displayed unusual intelligence and adaptability. They learned quickly, integrated into new communities with surprising ease, and frequently went on to become productive members of society despite their supposedly disadvantaged backgrounds. What if these weren't abandoned children at all? What if they were the products of a systematic cultivation program designed to rapidly repopulate areas that had been devastated by the catastrophe? What if the same advanced knowledge that preserved Enlightenment science also included the ability to artificially produce and raise human beings? The evidence for such capabilities appears in unexpected places. Alchemical texts from the period contain detailed descriptions of what they called homunculi, artificial beings created through chemical and biological processes. These weren't fantasy creatures, but technical descriptions using the symbolic language that preserved dangerous knowledge. The same symbols and processes appear in the architectural plans of the foundling hospitals and orphanages. Hidden in decorative elements and structural designs are encoded references to biological and chemical procedures that shouldn't have been understood for centuries. But the most compelling evidence comes from analyzing the genetic patterns of populations that emerged during this period. Modern DNA analysis has revealed something extraordinary about certain family lines that trace back to the 18th century. These bloodlines show genetic diversity patterns that are inconsistent with natural population bottlenecks. When a population experiences massive reduction followed by recovery, you expect to see genetic signatures of that bottleneck, limited diversity, founder effects, evidence of inbreeding among small survivor groups. But many 18th century population groups show the opposite pattern. They display genetic diversity that suggests artificial mixing of genetic material from multiple sources. This is exactly what you would expect if population recovery involved technological intervention rather than natural reproduction. Someone was deliberately combining genetic material to create viable populations with maximum diversity and health characteristics. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond historical curiosity. If human cultivation technology existed in the 18th century, if it was used to repopulate the world after a global catastrophe, then the fundamental assumptions about human development and population dynamics are wrong. We're not the product of natural evolution and reproduction. We're the result of deliberate engineering by a previous civilization that possessed capabilities we're only beginning to understand. The bloodlines that survived the catastrophe weren't just preserving knowledge and artifacts. They were preserving the ability to recreate humanity itself. This explains why the Enlightenment period saw such rapid advancement in so many fields simultaneously. It wasn't just that preserved knowledge was being revealed. It was that a new population was being created with enhanced capabilities and predetermined characteristics. The founding fathers of America, the great artists and scientists of Europe, the industrial pioneers who transformed the global economy, they weren't just randomly talented individuals. They were the products of a deliberate program to create a new human civilization with specific capabilities and characteristics. But here's the terrifying part. If this technology existed in the 18th century, it still exists today. The same bloodlines that manage the post-catastrophe recovery are still operating, still controlling the institutions that shape human development and population distribution. The sudden appearance of fertility clinics, genetic research facilities, and reproductive technologies in the 20th century wasn't the development of new science. It was the public revelation of capabilities that had been operating in secret for centuries. The declining birth rates in developed nations, the increasing reliance on artificial reproductive technologies, the growing use of genetic screening and modification, these aren't natural trends. They're the preparation phase for another population management program. Something is coming. The same cosmic cycles that destroyed the previous civilization are approaching again. The bloodlines that preserved humanity through the last catastrophe are preparing for the next one. And this time, they're not just planning to preserve knowledge and rebuild cities. They're planning to redesign humanity itself. The evidence appears in modern genetic research programs, in the massive databases being compiled of human DNA, in the development of artificial womb technologies and genetic editing capabilities. These aren't medical advances designed to help individual patients. They're components of a civilization-level backup system. When the next catastrophe hits, when the cities are buried again and most of the population is lost, the survivors won't have to spend centuries slowly rebuilding. They'll have the technology to recreate an entire civilization within decades, complete with a genetically optimized population designed to thrive in post-catastrophe conditions. But this new humanity won't be natural. It won't be the product of evolution and random chance. It will be artificial, designed, controlled by the same forces that have been managing human development since the last reset. We're living through the final phase of the current cycle. The evidence of the previous catastrophe has been preserved just long enough for us to understand what's coming. The buried cities, the mysterious photographs, the artistic documentation, they're all warnings, messages left by the survivors of 1700 to help us prepare for what they knew would eventually return. The question is whether we'll heed those warnings or continue living in the comfortable illusion that our civilization is permanent and natural. The choice may not be ours to make. The cycles operate according to cosmic forces beyond human control. But understanding them might give us some small measure of preparation for what's to come. The next reset is approaching. The signs are accumulating faster than ever before. And when it arrives, those who understand the true nature of human history will be better positioned to navigate whatever comes after. The evidence for this cyclical pattern of destruction and renewal becomes overwhelming when you examine the archaeological record through the lens of catastrophism rather than gradualism. We've been trained to think in terms of slow, uniform processes spanning millions of years. But what if the most dramatic changes in Earth's history happened suddenly, violently, in events that compressed millennia of change into moments of unimaginable destruction? Consider the mass extinction events that punctuate the geological timeline. The official story tells us these were gradual processes, climate changes that slowly eliminated species over thousands of years. But the actual evidence tells a different story. These extinctions happened fast, so fast that animals were caught mid-meal, their stomachs still full of food that hadn't had time to digest. So fast that entire ecosystems were buried intact, preserved as if someone had suddenly pressed a pause button on life itself. The Younger Dryas event 12,000 years ago provides a perfect example. In the space of perhaps a few decades, global temperatures plummeted, ice sheets advanced across continents, and dozens of megafauna species simply vanished from the fossil record. The standard explanation involves climate feedback loops and gradual environmental changes. But the evidence points to something much more dramatic. Across North America, archaeologists have found a layer of sediment dated to this period that contains extraordinary concentrations of platinum, iridium, and other elements that are rare on Earth but common in asteroids and comets. This isn't the signature of gradual climate change. This is the signature of cosmic impact. More disturbing still, this impact layer contains microscopic diamonds and glass spherules that only form under conditions of extreme heat and pressure. The kind of conditions you get when a massive object from space strikes the planet at tremendous velocity, instantly vaporizing whatever it hits and throwing billions of tons of superheated material into the atmosphere. But here's what makes this discovery truly unsettling. The same impact signature appears at other levels in the geological record, spaced at remarkably regular intervals. Every 12 to 13,000 years, something strikes our planet with enough force to alter the climate, trigger mass extinctions, and reset the entire trajectory of biological development. This isn't random cosmic bombardment. This is a cycle. And if you map out these impact events over the past 100,000 years, a terrifying pattern emerges. We're not just overdue for the next event. Based on the established timeline, we should be living through it right now. The astronomical evidence supports this conclusion. Our solar system is currently passing through a region of space known as the local interstellar cloud, a vast field of cosmic debris left over from ancient supernovae. Every orbit around the galaxy brings us into contact with different concentrations of this material. When we hit the dense patches, Earth gets bombarded with cosmic objects of various sizes. The Tunguska event in 1908 may have been a preview of what's coming. Something exploded in the Siberian wilderness with the force of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs, flattening 2,000 square kilometers of forest. No impact crater was ever found, suggesting the object exploded in the atmosphere before reaching the ground. But even that atmospheric burst was enough to knock down trees across an area larger than some countries. Now imagine not one Tunguska event, but thousands of them, occurring simultaneously across the globe. Imagine objects large enough to reach the ground, to vaporize cities, to throw enough debris into the atmosphere to block out the sun for years. This is what the geological record suggests happened 12,000 years ago. And it's what the evidence suggests happened again around 1700. The difference is that by 1700, human civilization had developed enough to leave more detailed records of the catastrophe. The buried cities we've discussed weren't just covered by gradually accumulating soil. They were buried by impact debris, by the fallout from a cosmic bombardment that turned the atmosphere into a rain of molten rock and superheated ash. The survivors of this event face challenges we can barely comprehend. The immediate devastation would have been followed by years of darkness as particles in the atmosphere blocked sunlight. Temperatures would have plummeted. Growing seasons would have failed. The complex supply chains that supported urban civilization would have collapsed entirely. Most of the population would have died not from the initial impacts, but from the prolonged winter that followed. Starvation, disease, and social collapse would have eliminated perhaps 90% of humanity within a few years of the catastrophe. The survivors would have been scattered, isolated groups clinging to life in whatever shelter they could find. But some groups were better prepared than others. The bloodlines that preserved advanced knowledge through previous catastrophes had learned to recognize the signs of approaching cosmic events. They had built underground facilities, stockpiled supplies, and developed technologies that could function even in post-impact conditions. When the bombardment ended and the skies began to clear, these prepared groups emerged to find a world transformed. The old cities were buried or destroyed. The old political structures had collapsed. Vast territories that had once supported millions of people were now empty wastelands waiting to be reclaimed. This was their opportunity to rebuild civilization according to their own design. They possessed knowledge that the scattered survivors had lost. They had resources that others lacked. Most importantly, they had a plan for managing the recovery process in ways that would ensure their continued dominance over human development. The Enlightenment wasn't just about reintroducing lost knowledge. It was about establishing new institutions that would control how that knowledge was distributed and applied. The Royal Society, the various Masonic organizations, the academic institutions that emerged during this period, they all served the same function: managing the flow of information to prevent dangerous truths from becoming widely known. These organizations didn't just preserve scientific knowledge, they preserved the understanding of cosmic cycles, of the predictable nature of global catastrophes, of the technologies needed to survive and rebuild after such events. But they kept this knowledge restricted to a small elite while feeding the general population carefully crafted narratives about gradual progress and natural development. The result is the world we live in today. A civilization that believes it's the pinnacle of human achievement unaware that it's actually recovering from near extinction, a population that thinks it's safe from cosmic threats, ignorant of the cycles that have reset human development dozens of times throughout history. But the signs of the approaching reset are becoming impossible to ignore. Solar activity is increasing in patterns that match previous catastrophic periods. The Earth's magnetic field, which provides our primary protection against cosmic radiation, is weakening at an accelerating rate. Asteroid and comet detection systems are identifying more potentially dangerous objects than ever before. Climate patterns are shifting in ways that don't match the models based on human industrial activity alone. Ocean currents are changing. Ice sheets are behaving unpredictably. The planet's entire atmospheric and hydrological systems seem to be responding to forces that our mainstream science refuses to acknowledge. Most telling of all, the same bloodlines that managed the recovery from the 1700 event are once again implementing massive infrastructure projects. Underground facilities are being constructed on an unprecedented scale. Seed banks and genetic repositories are being established in remote locations. Technologies for surviving prolonged periods without surface agriculture are being developed and tested. These aren't preparations for nuclear war or climate change in the conventional sense. These are preparations for the kind of global catastrophe that has reset human civilization repeatedly throughout history. The elites know what's coming because they've preserved the knowledge of previous cycles. They're getting ready while keeping the rest of humanity in the dark. The question is whether ordinary people can recognize the signs and take steps to prepare themselves. The historical record suggests that survival depends not just on having the right resources, but on understanding the true nature of the threat. Those who knew what was happening in 1700 had a much better chance of making it through the catastrophe than those who were caught completely off guard. The evidence we've examined throughout this investigation isn't just about understanding the past. It's about recognizing the patterns that govern human history and using that knowledge to navigate whatever comes next. The buried cities, the mysterious photographs, the artistic documentation, they're all pieces of a larger puzzle that reveals the cyclical nature of human development. We're not the first advanced civilization to inhabit this planet, and we won't be the last. The cosmic forces that destroyed our predecessors are still operating. The only question is whether we'll be prepared when they strike again, or whether we'll become another buried civilization for future archaeologists to puzzle over. The choice is ours, but the time for choosing is running out. The next reset may be closer than we think. The truth is no longer hidden. It's scattered across every major city on Earth, preserved in thousands of photographs, documented in artistic works that have been dismissed as fantasy for centuries. The evidence of the 1700 catastrophe surrounds us every single day, waiting for those brave enough to see it. We've traced the patterns of buried buildings, examined the systematic rewriting of history, analysed the artistic documentation of fresh ruins, and explored the coordinated effort to repopulate a devastated world. Every piece of evidence points to the same inescapable conclusion. Human civilization operates in cycles of rise, catastrophic destruction, and carefully managed recovery. The comfortable narrative of gradual progress that we've been taught is a lie designed to keep us ignorant of our true vulnerability. We're not the pinnacle of human achievement. We're survivors, descendants of those who rebuilt after unimaginable devastation, living in cities we didn't construct, using knowledge we didn't discover, following histories we didn't create. But perhaps the most unsettling revelation is that this isn't ancient history. The forces that destroyed the previous civilization are still operating. The cosmic cycles that buried entire cities under meters of debris haven't stopped. They're approaching again, and all the signs suggest we're living in the final phase of the current cycle. The same bloodlines that managed the recovery from 1700 are preparing for the next reset. They're building underground facilities, preserving genetic material, developing technologies for post-catastrophe survival. They know what's coming because they've preserved the knowledge that the rest of humanity was deliberately made to forget. The question now is what you do with this information. You can dismiss it, return to the comfortable illusion that our civilization is permanent and naturally developed. Or you can accept the terrifying truth that everything we think we know about our past has been carefully constructed to hide the cyclical nature of human development. The evidence is everywhere. The buried buildings in your city, the impossible precision of ancient architecture, the gaps in historical records around 1700, the artistic documentation of fresh catastrophe. Once you learn to see it, you can never unsee it. The next reset is coming. The only question is whether we'll be prepared, or whether we'll become another buried civilization for future generations to discover and puzzle over, wondering how such an advanced society could simply vanish from the historical record. The truth has been buried for 3 centuries, but it's finally breaking through. The question is, are you ready to face it?